June 5, 1944, the coast of England is quiet. A cold mist drifts over rows of armored vehicles waiting under tarps. Engines hum faintly in the darkness, the sound of an army holding its breath. Inside those steel shells, young men sit in silence, gripping their helmets, whispering to no one. Across the channel lies occupied France, and somewhere beyond it, the tanks they fear most, the German Panther. The world stood at a threshold. Factories in America thundered day and night, churning out the machines that would soon cross the sea. Men who once built farm tractors and family cars now forged the weapons of liberation. Their hands were calloused, their faces streaked with oil and sweat. They didn't carry rifles, but they armed the soldiers who would. In the industrial heart of Detroit, the arsenal of democracy pulsed like a living thing. Ford's vast River Rouge plant rolled out tank hulls by the hour. Chrysler's Detroit tank arsenal, a city within a city, assembled thousands of machines destined for battlefields most workers could barely pronounce. The air was filled with the clang of steel and the smell of burning paint. Each rivet driven, each bolt tightened, carried the weight of a nation's hope. And at the center of it all stood the M4 Sherman, America's standard bearer. It wasn't the heaviest nor the most powerful, but it was simple, reliable, and, above all, replaceable. A tank that could be built faster than it could be destroyed. Its birth had been an act of compromise and faith. American generals didn't want a weapon of terror, they wanted a weapon of logistics. A tank that could cross oceans, roll off ships, and keep moving without special tools or exotic fuel. They called it practical. Its enemies called it naive. Across the continent, in the ruins of bombed-out German cities, another vision of war was taking shape. In 1942, the Wehrmacht had faced a nightmare on the Eastern Front, the Soviet T-34. It was fast, angled, deadly, a machine that humbled the mighty panzers. In response, German engineers conceived their answer, the Panther. It was an engineer's masterpiece and a mechanic's curse. Its armor sloped like the T-34's, but thicker. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could punch through any Allied tank at 2,000 meters. On paper, it was perfection, the apex predator of the armored battlefield. But under its heavy plates hid fragility. Its gearbox failed under stress. Its suspension cracked in the cold. Its engine, powerful but temperamental, often caught fire before reaching the front. Still, to the men who drove it, the Panther was something more than a machine. It was pride-made steel, a symbol that, even in the twilight of the Reich, German ingenuity could defy defeat. On the eve of D-Day, these two machines, born of different worlds, waited to meet for the first time. One forged in abundance, the other in desperation. One built to endure, the other to dominate. Both carrying men who would soon learn that inside a tank, war becomes deeply personal. In southern England, American crews spent their last night rehearsing. They studied maps by candlelight. They checked their radios, their rations, their escape hatches. They joked, quietly, about how thin the Sherman's armor looked compared to the Panthers they'd seen in intelligence photos. Paper tanks, one corporal muttered. We'll be cooked before we even see them. His sergeant didn't answer. He just lit another cigarette, staring at the dark horizon. Inside the ship's hold, the tanks were chained and braced, rocking gently with the tide. The men could feel their heartbeat echo in the steel. Outside, rain drummed on the deck, steady, relentless, like the ticking of a clock counting down to invasion. For many of them, the Sherman wasn't just a weapon. It was home. They gave them names, Cindy Lou, Ruthless, Lucky 7. They painted them with playing cards, hometown flags, girls' names written in chalk. In the confined space of steel and oil, these little touches of humanity mattered. Because once the ramp dropped, sentiment had no place in war. Meanwhile, across the channel, German tank crews prepared their defenses. In hedgerow country, Panthers were dug in beneath camouflage nets, their barrels aimed towards the beaches. Crews slept beside their machines, weapons within reach. They had no illusions about what was coming. The Allies were coming in force, but they believed in their machines. To them, the Panther was invincible. A German commander once said, "Give me 5 Panthers and I will stop 50 Shermans." He wasn't exaggerating, not entirely. The Panther's gun could pierce the Sherman's armor at long range, while the Sherman's shells often bounced off harmlessly. But numbers had a language of their own, and in this war production was power. Far from the battlefield, American engineers in Washington debated armor angles, gear ratios, and fuel efficiency. They knew about the Panther. They studied captured reports, field photos, fragments of burnt hulls. Some urged for a new tank, heavier, stronger, faster. Others insisted the Sherman could evolve. War, they said, was a marathon, not a contest of who could build the biggest gun. That debate would soon move from paper to mud, from blueprints to Normandy's hedgerows. As the night deepened, the invasion fleet stirred. Engines roared to life, echoing across the harbor like distant thunder. Men climbed into their tanks and fastened their hatches. There was no more waiting, no more designing, no more testing, only the long crossing into history. The sky began to lighten, pale gray over the water. To the east, the horizon glowed faintly, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Somewhere out there, beyond that glow, the Panther waited, its crew listening to the same wind, thinking the same thoughts. Neither side wanted this war anymore, but both would fight it to the end. The silence before dawn was heavy with inevitability. Soon, steel would meet steel, and the ideals of two nations, mass and precision, freedom and order, would be tested not by speeches, but by the sound of guns. The storm was coming, and when it broke, the world of armored warfare would never be the same again. June 7, 1944, Normandy, France. The rain has turned the beaches into mud and blood. Columns of Sherman tanks grind inland, their treads slipping over the bodies of the fallen. Ahead, a line of dark shapes waits beyond the hedgerows. German Panthers. Engines growl, guns elevate, and in that single heartbeat of silence before impact, the tank war in Europe truly begins. The invasion of Europe was no longer a plan. It was happening. By the second day after D-Day, the beaches of Normandy were a maze of wreckage and determination. Shermans rolled through the surf, dripping seawater, their crews squinting through rain and smoke. The first clashes with German armor came quickly, brutal, short, and unforgiving. To many Allied crews, the Panther wasn't just another enemy tank. It was a monster born from rumor and whispered fear. Its long 75mm gun, the KWK-42L70, could pierce a Sherman's frontal armor long before the Americans could close to return fire. Its armor was sloped, thick, and deceptive. Shells ricocheted off like stones skipping across a pond. One gunner described his first encounter. "We hit it 3 times. The rounds just slid off. Then it turned its turret, slow, deliberate, and one shot went straight through us." That was the breaking point, not of machines, but of illusion. The men inside those Shermans realized they were not driving the better tank, but they were fighting for something larger than steel. In the hedgerows of Normandy, battles were fought at distances of 100 meters or less. Visibility was a cruel joke. Every turn, every orchard could hide a German gun. The air was thick with the stench of oil, mud, and fear. Shermans advanced cautiously, their commanders standing half exposed through open hatches, scanning for movement. When the Panther struck, it was like lightning, sudden, precise, devastating. A shell would tear through a Sherman's hull, igniting fuel and ammunition. In an instant, the tank became a furnace. Inside, men had seconds to escape. The Sherman's designers had learned from North Africa. They had added wet ammunition storage, encasing shells and water-filled jackets to reduce fire. It worked sometimes. Many crews owed their lives to that innovation. Others were not so lucky. Yet even in the face of this imbalance, the Americans adapted with remarkable speed. They learned to flank, to use numbers, to call in air and artillery as extensions of their armor. If one Sherman couldn't outgun a Panther, 5 could outmaneuver it. They fought not as duelists, but as a team, tank, infantry, and sky united in motion. Back in Germany, the High Command was elated. Reports claimed that for every Panther lost, 10 Shermans burned. On paper, it looked like victory, but beneath those numbers, cracks were forming. The Panther's mechanical soul was fragile. Its transmission failed under stress, its engine overheated, its tracks jammed in mud. Many never even reached the front line. The German army had designed a masterpiece of engineering, but not of endurance. War, after all, punishes perfection. It rewards what survives. By mid-June, the Allied push inland had turned into a brutal slugging match. Towns like Carentan and Villers-Bocage became names etched in memory. In one narrow street, British and American tank crews faced ambushes so sudden that entire columns vanished within minutes. The legendary German ace Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger, cut through Allied armor like a scythe through wheat, a reminder that experience and position could still defy mass production. But for every Panther or Tiger that struck, another wave of Shermans came ashore. By July, over 1,500 American tanks were fighting across Normandy, supported by thousands more in reserve. For every German tank destroyed, replacement was agony, limited parts, scarce fuel, bombed railways. The Reich could no longer match the rhythm of American industry. Inside the Sherman, the war was intensely human. Crews lived, fought, and sometimes died within inches of each other. The gunner's cheek brushed the breech. The loader's knuckles bled from shattered shell casings. The driver's boots slipped on oil-soaked floor plates. The intercom buzzed with clipped orders and the soft edge of fear. Traverse right, fire! A deafening crack, a jolt through the spine. The smell of cordite and burning paint filled the air. If they were lucky, the target smoked. If not, another German round came in return. Even the veterans admitted the Sherman was not built for comfort, but it was built for chance. A man could live long enough to jump free. The hatches were wide, the fire suppressants real. Survival in war is sometimes the most important measure of design. The Germans didn't see it that way. They measured success in kill counts, not in longevity. To them, the Panther's purpose was to dominate the battlefield, not endure it. But domination requires control, and control requires fuel, parts, and time. By the summer of '44, Germany was running out of all three. In a French village called Saint-Lô, a young American lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We've lost half our tanks this week, but we still move forward. The Panthers can kill us, but they can't stop us." That single line captured the truth of Normandy. The Panther could destroy, but it couldn't decide. The Sherman could burn, but it kept coming back. The Americans had discovered the secret rhythm of war, not victory through superiority, but through persistence. Steel could be replaced. Men, heartbreakingly, could not. And yet, they kept fighting, because the war left no room for hesitation. By late June, the Allies had learned to fight differently. They avoided frontal duels, used smoke screens, coordinated artillery barrages before advancing. The M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman appeared, heavier armor, thicker plating, a defiant reply to the Panther's reign. It was slow, but it could take a hit, and sometimes that was all that mattered. Every adaptation was written in blood. Every improvement came from what was lost the day before. As the smoke rose over Normandy's fields, both sides began to realize the same thing. The war of machines was also a war of endurance between what could be built faster and what could survive longer. The Panther fought for fear and pride. The Sherman fought for momentum and hope. And as the front pushed inland toward Caen, a quiet truth settled over every tank crew on both sides, that no amount of armor could protect a man from the weight of history. The breaking point had come and gone. Now began the long, grinding test of who could hold on longest. July 28, 1944, Saint-Lô, France. The air is thick with dust and flame. Columns of black smoke twist into the summer sky. The earth trembles beneath hundreds of engines. In the hedgerows below, Sherman crews brace for the counterattack. A wave of panthers rolling out of the tree line. The Battle of Normandy has become a furnace, and inside it, steel begins to melt. By midsummer, the quiet rhythm of the invasion had vanished. What began as cautious advances now resembled a storm of iron and fire. Sherman after Sherman poured into the Bocage country, their crews learning by instinct, not manual, how to survive. The hedgerows, thick as walls, broke lines of sight and shattered formations. Tank warfare became intimate, brutal at ranges so close you could smell the enemy's exhaust. A gunner named Harold Pruitt later wrote, "We weren't fighting across fields anymore. We were fighting through gardens, walls, doorways, house to house, hedge to hedge. You never saw the German until you were staring down his barrel." For the Panther, this terrain was both a blessing and a curse. Its long gun, built for distance, lost advantage in tight quarters. Its heavy hull made turning slow, awkward, but its first shot, always, was lethal. A Panther that fired first rarely missed. For the Sherman crews, every mile inland felt like borrowed time. They called their tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. But they adapted fast. They learned to attack from multiple angles, using speed and confusion as their armor. And they learned the value of smoke, clouds of white phosphorus hiding their movement, even as it stung their eyes and lungs. Inside a tank, battle is a symphony of chaos. The roar of the engine drowns thought. The metallic smell of oil mixes with the sharp tang of gunpowder. Every shot fired feels like being kicked in the chest. Every impact went like the world collapsing inward. The loader works without pause, sweating, shouting, feeding shells into the breach with trembling hands. The gunner squints through the periscope, trying to see shapes through smoke. The commander shouts over the intercom, "Traverse left. Fire again!" And the driver, the most silent of all, keeps them alive, steering through hell without ever seeing it. One moment of error, 1 second of hesitation, and the tank becomes a coffin. By August, the Allies had begun Operation Cobra, a massive armored breakout meant to shatter German resistance in Normandy. For the first time, the full might of American industry was on display. Thousands of tanks rolling forward behind curtains of artillery and carpet bombing. It was overwhelming and terrifying. The ground shook with a sound not of battle, but of industry-made war. German defenders, including Panther battalions, tried to hold the line, but they faced not just men, but machines that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. For every Panther that burned, 10 more Shermans arrived. For every bridge destroyed, the engineers built 2 more. The American advance became a tide, not elegant, not invincible, but unstoppable. Still, the cost was unbearable. Entire crews vanished in an instant. Tanks turned to molten wrecks by a single well-placed shell. In the chaos, compassion and cruelty lived side by side. Medics crawled through fire to pull survivors from burning hulls. German snipers picked them off as they worked. It was war reduced to its most primitive truth: endurance. The Panther's gunners were ruthless and skilled. They used their superior optics to strike first. They waited in shadow, in churchyards, behind stone walls. They fired from stillness, then vanished. To the Allies they seemed everywhere, ghosts in the hedgerows. But the ghosts had their weaknesses. A single hit to a Panther's side armor or rear could destroy it, and its fragile drivetrain betrayed it time and again. Many Panthers were found abandoned, their engines seized, their fuel gone. They had died not in battle, but in exhaustion. One American mechanic walking through a captured village found 5 Panthers lined up by a road, all burned out. He wrote, They looked magnificent, even in ruin. But every one of them was dead because someone forgot to change the oil. By late July, the human toll became harder to hide. Crews that had started the campaign laughing together now spoke in half sentences, their eyes dull from smoke and fatigue. Every new tank arrival meant replacements for someone who didn't make it. Dog tags were collected like spare parts. The smell of burning rubber clung to their clothes, their hair, their dreams. A war correspondent who rode with an armored battalion wrote, "You don't hear courage in their voices anymore. You hear duty, hear dry, cold, and unstoppable." It was the voice of men who had seen too much. The Germans, too, were breaking. Their logistics had collapsed under Allied air supremacy. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was scarce. Panther crews were ordered to fight until the last shell, and then destroy their tanks to prevent capture. They obeyed, even when they knew it meant dying in them. In one field near Mortain, after a failed counterattack, a Sherman crew found a Panther still smoldering. Inside, the 5 men were frozen in their positions, their uniforms untouched by flame, only their faces blackened by smoke. The gun pointed skyward, as if in surrender. War has no mercy, not even for its machines. The landscape of France changed forever that summer. Fields once green became charred wastelands. Every village carried the echo of tanks, the grinding of treads, the hiss of hydraulics, the thunder of main guns. And yet, amid that destruction, progress continued. Each battle, each loss, each innovation pushed the Allies closer to the heart of Germany. For the men inside those tanks, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like surviving one more day. As August closed, the Allies finally broke through. The German lines cracked. Panthers, too few and too fragile, retreated east. But the shadow they cast remained, a reminder of how thin the line was between courage and terror, between machine and man. For the Sherman crews who lived through it, the world was no longer divided between victory and defeat, only between those who made it home and those who didn't. The war had entered its cruelest phase, and in the smoldering fields of Normandy, the age of armored warfare had found its voice, cold, mechanical, and unrelenting. Detroit, 1944. The hum of machinery replaces the sound of battle. Men and women in oil-stained overalls move with precision, their faces lit by sparks from welding torches. This is not a battlefield, yet every bolt, every plate, every tank that leaves these doors will decide who lives and who dies. They call it the arsenal of democracy, and its pulse is relentless. While tank crews bled in Normandy, another army fought a different kind of war, one measured not in lives, but in output. Factories across America, from Michigan to Pennsylvania, from Ohio to California, thundered day and night. Ford, Chrysler, Fisher Body, Baldwin Locomotive, companies that once built cars, locomotives and washing machines, now forged armor, turrets and engines, the Sherman tank, though born in 1941, evolved continuously because of them. Every battle fed lessons back across the Atlantic, where engineers worked feverishly to redesign, reinforce, and reimagine. The result was a living machine, one that grew smarter, stronger, and safer as the war marched on. One of those men was Robert L. Hall, a Grumman engineer who had once designed naval aircraft. In 1942, he stood over a drafting table littered with blueprints of the TBF Avenger. By 1944, his designs were influencing armored vehicle systems, fuel containment, ballistics absorption, and structural reinforcement. Hall later said, "We stopped thinking about machines as tools and started thinking about them as lifeboats." That mindset saved lives. When reports came back from Europe describing Shermans brewing up or erupting into flames when hit, engineers knew something had to change. The culprit, the way ammunition was stored. In the early Shermans, shells were stacked dry around the turret ring, an easy target for penetration. The fix was revolutionary yet simple. Wet stowage. Engineers submerged the ammunition racks in a glycol water mix, drastically reducing the chance of explosion. The change was quiet, technical, and utterly life-saving. In the following months, tank fire casualties dropped by nearly 80%. Crews began to trust their machines again. Inside the armor, they could finally breathe, yet safety was only one front in this industrial war. Power and protection demanded constant balance. The Panther's thick armor and powerful gun made it deadly, but its complexity made it fragile. The Sherman, lighter and simpler, could be mass-produced, but against a Panther it was outgunned. The solution? Evolution through necessity. Enter the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, a beast forged for breakthroughs. Its armor was doubled, its silhouette heavier, more menacing. To the crews, it felt like a bunker on tracks. To the Germans, it was a new kind of threat, one that refused to die easily. Lieutenant Jack Morrison, a tank commander with the 743rd Tank Battalion, recalled, "When you drove the Jumbo, you felt the hits, but you didn't feel fear." The old girl could take punishment. She wasn't pretty, but she kept us alive. As war technology advanced, so did the people building it. For the first time in history, women took up roles once reserved for men: welders, machinists, inspectors. They worked through nights, through exhaustion, through grief. Many had lost sons or brothers overseas. Now, with steady hands, they built the machines that might save others. Photographs from 1944 show women standing beside half-assembled Shermans, sleeves rolled up, sparks flying. Their faces are set with quiet determination. Each rivet was a promise, each tank a statement of faith that this war could be won not by hatred, but by effort. Meanwhile, innovation was spreading through the ranks of Allied command. Captured German tanks, Panthers and Tigers left smoldering on European roads, were shipped back to testing grounds. Engineers dismantled them piece by piece, studying their secrets. Optics, sloping armor, suspension, everything was examined. The result was not imitation, but adaptation. From those discoveries came ideas that would shape the future of tank design for decades. Sloped armor became standard for better deflection. High-velocity guns became essential for long-range penetration. Optical precision became the next frontier of targeting systems. The Sherman, though destined to fade after the war, carried within it the DNA of everything that would follow. The Pershing, the Patton, the Abrams, the Panther's shadow lingered, not as a symbol of German supremacy, but as a benchmark of what had to be surpassed. Still, for all the genius behind the blueprints, progress never came without guilt. Every improvement, every upgrade was born from tragedy, from reports written in blood. Design notes were annotated with words like catastrophic loss and total burn. Engineers knew what those phrases meant, that somewhere 5 men had died so they could learn one lesson. Robert Hall wrote in his journal, "Our measurements are in inches and calibers. Theirs are in minutes lived." By the end of 1944, America's factories had produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks, 50,000 steel bodies, 50,000 chances at survival. The numbers defied imagination, each tank a product of thousands of hours, thousands of hands. A nation once known for automobiles had become the greatest war manufacturer in history. And yet, behind every gleaming assembly line, there lingered a somber truth. Each machine built meant another man sent into danger. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a phrase, it was a pact, a promise that sacrifice at home would meet sacrifice abroad. On Christmas Eve 1944, a letter arrived at the Fisher Body plant in Michigan. It was from a tank crew stationed in Belgium. "You don't know us, but you built our tank. She took 5 hits last week, 3 on the side, 1 through the turret. We're still here, so thank you, whoever you are. Merry Christmas. The letter was pinned to the factory wall. The workers never met the men who wrote it, but that note carried more weight than any medal. It was proof that what they built mattered, that behind every tank there was a heartbeat worth saving. As 1945 dawned, the Sherman had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of endurance, of what happens when a nation's hands and hearts move in unison. Every improvement born of loss, every victory built from effort, every turn of a wrench echoing the cry of battlefields an ocean away. War had turned industry into a weapon, but also into something deeper. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, creation still triumphed over destruction. The tanks rolled out of the factories, their engines growling with purpose. And somewhere in Europe men waited, praying those engines would carry them home. Berlin, May 1945. The guns have fallen silent. Smoke drifts over a city of stone and ash. Tank tracks lie half buried in rubble, their steel bodies frozen mid-motion, as if the war had stopped in the middle of a breath. Somewhere a radio still hums with static, and for the first time in years, there is nothing left to destroy. Victory, they called it, but for those who had lived the war, who had built, fought, and survived it, victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. Across Europe, burned-out tanks lined the roadsides. Sherman, Panther, Tiger, once proud machines, now rusting monuments to a madness finally spent. Children climbed on them as if they were playgrounds. Farmers used their shells as water troughs. The instruments of war had become relics of survival. In Normandy's hedgerows, in the forests of the Ardennes, and on the plains of Germany, the echoes of steel and fire gave way to the murmur of wind and birdsong. But the land remembered. The earth was scarred, not just by shells and tracks, but by the memory of men who had fought there. For tank crews, the silence was both mercy and curse. After years of tension, of being hunted and hunting in turn, they found peace unbearable. Sergeant David Carver, who had served in a Sherman during the Battle of the Bulge, later said, "The first night after the war ended, I couldn't sleep. The quiet felt wrong, like waiting for a shell that never came." He wasn't alone. Many veterans carried the weight of sound, the roar of engines, the clang of shells, the screams of metal and men. Even decades later, some said they could still hear their tanks breathing in the dark. Back home, the factories that had once thundered with production now stood still. The great lines of Detroit went silent. Where sparks once flew, dust began to settle. Posters that had read, "We can do it," now hung faded, curling at the edges. The men and women who had built the arsenal of democracy returned to ordinary life, but ordinary felt strange. A welder named Eleanor Nash, who had spent 4 years assembling turret armor for the Sherman, wrote in her diary, "We spent the war building things meant to save lives, but everything we built was also meant to destroy. I don't know what to do with my hands now that they aren't building for war." Her words echoed a nation's confusion. The war had demanded everything: purpose, energy, identity. Now, with peace, there was only emptiness. In Europe, soldiers wandered among wreckage, searching for meaning. Some collected souvenirs: a helmet, a shell casing, a photo from a fallen tank's dashboard. Others simply walked, trying to understand what it had all been for. One American officer described finding a Panther tank half submerged in a river near Cologne. Its hatch was open, the crew gone. Inside, he found a German soldier's notebook, sketches of engines, family portraits, a child's drawing folded between pages. "He wasn't my enemy anymore," the officer wrote. "He was a man who built things like me." That moment, simple and wordless, carried the truth no victory parade could show. Beneath the flags and slogans, Every soldier had fought for the same fragile hope, to survive long enough to see peace again. The Sherman crews returned home to quiet towns and uneasy gratitude. They weren't greeted as heroes, not really. The world wanted to forget the images of burning tanks and broken men. But within their silence lived stories no one else could tell. In one small Kansas town, a veteran named Sam Red Halverson kept a piece of shrapnel in a jar on his shelf. It had been torn from his Sherman's side when it was hit in Luxembourg. He called it the piece that missed my heart. When asked about the war, he would just smile faintly and say, "The tank took the rest." The machines, too, bore the marks of their service. Thousands of Shermans were scrapped, melted down, recycled into cars, bridges, and rail lines. The rest were abandoned overseas, scattered across the old front lines like ghosts. Yet a few were preserved: museum pieces, memorials, symbols of an age when human hands built both hope and horror from steel. Visitors would stare at their dented armor and ask, "Was it really that bad?" The guides always answered the same way: it was worse. For the engineers, peace brought its own burden. Robert L. Hall and others like him returned to civilian projects, commercial vehicles, construction machines, aircraft, but they could never unsee the past. Hall once said, "When you've designed something that kills, even for a just cause, you never quite look at a blueprint the same way again." He stopped working on military contracts in 1947. Instead, he began designing hospital equipment, quiet machines that saved lives instead of taking them. It was his own form of redemption. The Germans faced their own long night. The Panther, once feared, became a symbol of futility, a masterpiece of engineering defeated by numbers, by reliability, by endurance. In the ruins of factories like MAN and Daimler-Benz, engineers sifted through twisted steel, trying to understand where brilliance had turned to blindness. Some would go on to design for post-war industries, automobiles, trains, even early space research, their wartime expertise repurposed for peace. Others vanished into the gray fog of history. But history itself doesn't sleep. It watches, it remembers. And as Europe rebuilt, the rusting hulks of Shermans and Panthers became silent teachers. To children growing up in the ruins, they were not weapons. They were warnings. A French villager in Normandy once told a journalist, "We used to play on the tanks. We didn't know what they meant. Only later did we understand those machines gave us the world we have now." By the end of 1945, the war was over in name only. The world had entered its long night, a fragile peace overshadowed by what had been learned and lost. Tanks slept under rain and ivy, engineers wrestled with conscience, and soldiers carried invisible scars into a quiet that few could understand. The Sherman, once the symbol of strength, became a relic of endurance. The Panther, once the icon of power, became a monument to wasted brilliance. And between them lay the truth of every war, that victory is not the absence of loss, but the endurance of humanity in spite of it. The guns were silent, but beneath the silence, history still whispered. Through the steel, through the earth, through the lives forever shaped by what they built. "War teaches us how to fight," a veteran once said, "but peace teaches us what it cost." Berlin, May 1945. The guns have fallen silent. Smoke drifts over a city of stone and ash. Tank tracks lie half buried in rubble, their steel bodies frozen mid-motion, as if the war had stopped in the middle of a breath. Somewhere a radio still hums with static, and for the first time in years, there is nothing left to destroy. Victory, they called it. But for those who had lived the war, who had built, fought, and survived it, victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. Across Europe, burned-out tanks lined the roadsides, Sherman, Panther, Tiger, once proud machines, now rusting monuments to a madness finally spent. Children climbed on them as if they were playgrounds. Farmers used their shells as water troughs. The instruments of war had become relics of survival. In Normandy's hedgerows, in the forests of the Ardennes, and on the plains of Germany, the echoes of steel and fire gave way to the murmur of wind and birdsong. But the land remembered. The earth was scarred, not just by shells and tracks, but by the memory of men who had fought there. For tank crews, the silence was both mercy and curse. After years of tension, of being hunted and hunting in turn, they found peace unbearable. Sergeant David Carver, who had served in a Sherman during the Battle of the Bulge, later said, "The first night after the war ended, I couldn't sleep. The quiet felt wrong, like waiting for a shell that never came." He wasn't alone. Many veterans carried the weight of sound, the roar of engines, the clang of shells, the screams of metal and men. Even decades later, some said they could still hear their tanks breathing in the dark. Back home, the factories that had once thundered with production now stood still. The great lines of Detroit went silent. Where sparks once flew, dust began to settle. Posters that had read, "We can do it," now hung faded, curling at the edges. The men and women who had built the arsenal of democracy returned to ordinary life. But ordinary felt strange. A welder named Eleanor Nash, who had spent 4 years assembling turret armor for the Sherman, wrote in her diary, "We spent the war building things meant to save lives, but everything we built was also meant to destroy. I don't know what to do with my hands now that they aren't building for war." Her words echoed a nation's confusion. The war had demanded everything: purpose, energy, identity. Now, with peace, there was only emptiness. In Europe, soldiers wandered among wreckage, searching for meaning. Some collected souvenirs: a helmet, a shell casing, a photo from a fallen tank's dashboard. Others simply walked, trying to understand what it had all been for. One American officer described finding a Panther tank half submerged in a river near Cologne. Its hatch was open, the crew gone. Inside, he found a German soldier's notebook, sketches of engines, family portraits, a child's drawing folded between pages. "He wasn't my enemy anymore," the officer wrote. "He was a man who built things like me." That moment, simple and wordless, carried the truth no victory parade could show. Beneath the flags and slogans, every soldier had fought for the same fragile hope: to survive long enough to see peace again. The Sherman crews returned home to quiet towns and uneasy gratitude. They weren't greeted as heroes, not really. The world wanted to forget the images of burning tanks and broken men. But within their silence lived stories no one else could tell. In one small Kansas town, a veteran named Sam Red Halverson kept a piece of shrapnel in a jar on his shelf. It had been torn from his Sherman's side when it was hit in Luxembourg. He called it "the piece that missed my heart." When asked about the war, he would just smile faintly and say, "The tank took the rest." The machines, too, bore the marks of their service. Thousands of Shermans were scrapped, melted down, recycled into cars, bridges, and rail lines. The rest were abandoned overseas, scattered across the old front lines like ghosts. Yet a few were preserved: museum pieces, memorials, symbols of an age when human hands built both hope and horror from steel. Visitors would stare at their dented armor and ask, "Was it really that bad?" The guides always answered the same way: it was worse. For the engineers, peace brought its own burden. Robert L. Hall and others like him returned to civilian projects: commercial vehicles, construction machines, aircraft. But they could never unsee the past. Hall once said, "When you've designed something that kills, even for a just cause, you never quite look at a blueprint the same way again." He stopped working on military contracts in 1947. Instead, he began designing hospital equipment, quiet machines that saved lives instead of taking them. It was his own form of redemption. The Germans faced their own long night. The Panther, once feared, became a symbol of futility, a masterpiece of engineering defeated by numbers, by reliability, by endurance. In the ruins of factories like MAN and Daimler-Benz, engineers sifted through twisted steel, trying to understand where brilliance had turned to blindness. Some would go on to design for post-war industries, automobiles, trains, even early space research, their wartime expertise repurposed for peace. Others vanished into the gray fog of history. But history itself doesn't sleep. It watches, it remembers. And as Europe rebuilt, the rusting hulks of Shermans and Panthers became silent teachers. To children growing up in the ruins, they were not weapons. They were warnings. A French villager in Normandy once told a journalist, "We used to play on the tanks. We didn't know what they meant. Only later did we understand those machines gave us the world we have now." By the end of 1945, the war was over in name only. The world had entered its long night, a fragile peace overshadowed by what had been learned and lost. Tanks slept under rain and ivy, engineers wrestled with conscience, and soldiers carried invisible scars into a quiet that few could understand. The Sherman, once the symbol of strength, became a relic of endurance. The Panther, once the icon of power, became a monument to wasted brilliance, and between them lay the truth of every war, that victory is not the absence of loss, but the endurance of humanity in spite of it. The guns were silent, but beneath the silence, history still whispered. Through the steel, through the earth, through the lives forever shaped by what they built. War teaches us how to fight, a veteran once said, but peace teaches us what it cost. A museum hall, the floor gleams under soft light. Children press their faces to the glass, staring at a tank older than their grandparents. Its armor is scarred, its paint faded, its turret fixed forever toward a horizon long gone. A plaque reads simply, M4 Sherman, 1942. The war has ended, but its memory still breathes. Time has done what bombs could not. It has silenced the engines. The battlefields have grown quiet. The machines have turned to monuments. Yet beneath their stillness lies a heartbeat, a pulse of history that refuses to die. For the Sherman, the story did not end in 1945. It continued across decades and continents, wherever men sought to understand how courage and machinery intertwined. From Korea to Israel, from the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Indochina, the Sherman rolled again, a survivor of a vanished era, reborn for new wars that learned from the old. And yet, in every one of those conflicts, its presence carried something more than firepower. It carried memory. In contrast, the Panther, that symbol of German engineering and pride, became a relic almost overnight. Its design inspired fear during the war and admiration after it. Engineers studied its lines, its suspension, its angles. They copied what worked, learned from what failed. The Panther's ghost lived on. In the curves of the Soviet T-54, the armor of the British Centurion, the balance of the American M26 Pershing. Even the modern M1 Abrams, born decades later, carries faint echoes of both rivals. The Sherman's reliability, the Panther's precision. The two tanks, once enemies, became in time collaborators through history. Opposites that together define the evolution of armored warfare. But legacies are not built from steel alone. They are built from stories, from the memories of those who lived inside the machines and those who built them. In a veteran's home in Pennsylvania, an old tank commander named Jack Morrison sits in a wheelchair facing the sunset. Beside him, on a small table, lies a photograph. 5 young men leaning against a Sherman, their faces smeared with oil and youth. 4 of them never came home. He doesn't talk much about the war anymore. When asked what the tank meant to him, he says quietly, "It wasn't a weapon. It was a home. For a while it was the only home we had." There is pride in his voice, but also something softer, something broken. He survived, but survival is its own kind of burden. In Germany, the story is different, quieter, heavier. At a restoration yard near Munich, a small team of volunteers spends weekends repairing an old Panther tank. They polish its surfaces, replace rusted bolts, and carefully paint over scars left by shrapnel. They work not to glorify, but to remember. One of them, a historian named Hans Keller, puts it simply, "We don't restore it to celebrate the past. We restore it so no one forgets what the past became." The Panther to them is not a symbol of power, it is a caution, a reminder that brilliance without conscience leads only to ruin. In archives and universities, the war is still studied, not as myth, but as mirror. Every line of a blueprint, every production report, every field diary reveals the same truth. Humanity creates its own contradictions. The same hands that build cities also build machines that can destroy them. And yet, through that contradiction, progress endures. Because each war, in all its horror, teaches what peace must protect. Decades after the war, Robert L. Hall was invited to speak at a military engineering symposium. He was an old man by then, his voice frail but steady. Before him sat a generation of young designers, men and women who had grown up in a world his machines helped to shape. He looked at them for a long moment, then said, "When we built the Sherman, we didn't build it to win. We built it so someone else could live to see tomorrow. That's all any engineer can hope for, that his creation outlives destruction." When he finished, no one applauded. They just sat in silence, the kind of silence that belongs only to truth. Today, those truths linger in the places where memory and metal meet. In Normandy, rusting Shermans still lie half-buried in hedgerows, their hulls filled with wildflowers. In the forests near Bastogne, Panther tracks still scar the ground like the imprint of something ancient and restless. And in the halls of museums, under polished lights and whispered awe, they face each other again, no longer as enemies, but as storytellers. Children look at them and ask questions. Parents explain what war was and what it cost. And somewhere between those words, the legacy continues, not as pride, not as shame, but as remembrance. Because the legacy of war is not the steel it leaves behind. It is the silence that follows. It is the names carved into granite. It is the engineer who can no longer sleep, the veteran who never speaks, the historian who keeps writing, hoping that if he tells the story well enough, maybe it won't happen again. War, in the end, is not forgotten. It only changes its shape, from fire to film, from memory to monument, from sorrow to warning. A child touches the cold armor of a Sherman and asks, "Did people really fight inside this?" The guide nods, and in that nod lies the entire weight of the 20th century. The camera pulls back, the museum fading into darkness. The narrator's voice slows, almost a whisper. The Sherman and the Panther, two machines born from opposite worlds, now rest side by side in history. One built for endurance, the other for power. Both reminders that war is not measured by who wins, but by who remembers. Because war doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.